When you look at the blood levels of estrogen, when this is what many practitioners are doing, as the transition goes on through perimenopause and into menopause, estrogen levels fall dramatically. And the assumption is that must be the driver of the symptoms. Let's replace it. But the reality is, just because those levels are falling in the blood doesn't mean that there's actually a systemic deficiency in estrogen.
I'm Anne-Marie McQueen, journalist and proud 50-ish woman, and we are here looking for the true truth in perimenopause, menopause, midlife, and beyond.
Opening our minds to other possibilities is not always easy.
Hotflash Inc.
You're all woman to me. All right, Anne-Marie.
Has your doctor told you that you're too young for perimenopause? You just don't feel like yourself? You are not alone. Perimenopause can start earlier than you think. That's why MenoLab is here to support you with a range of products and the information you need to confidently speak up and get the care you deserve. They also offer science-backed products like their bestseller, MenoFit, a probiotic designed to help relieve symptoms like hot flashes and night sweats and more, all while supporting your overall health and wellness. Don't settle for less. Visit MenoLab and get the support you need today. Right now, they're offering our Hotflash Inc. listeners 20% off using code HOTFLASH20 at menolabs.com. Now for the small print, this statement has not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Welcome to the Hotflash Inc. podcast. I am super excited. I know I say that a lot, but I have Jay Feldman on the Hotflash Inc. podcast. Now, Jay is a health coach, an independent health researcher, and host of the Energy Balance podcast. Jay goes deep. He has degrees in neuroscience and exercise physiology, but he decided to forgo medical school after realizing that the conventional medical approach was not the solution to the health problems that so many of us face. Now, a lot of what Jay says is going to sound strange to you. We're going to focus on hormones because he has a completely different take on that, deeply researched and science-based. He challenges conventional paradigms, and he is alternative man, really in this menopause space. But we've had a few people on the podcast who are on this kind of thinking. We're opening it up. We're trying to get a sense of what the wide spectrum thinks, and I really want Jay to explain this to you, and I want him to explain it to me because I am writing a book and putting together a summit, and this is one part that I have so many questions. And I'll probably tell Jay this. I won't be able to stop myself, but he was instrumental. His podcast and his research was instrumental to me piecing together thyroid, fatty liver, gut dysbiosis, leaky gut, all of that, and the things I was doing that were actually making things worse. I am super excited about this. Jay Feldman. Okay, Jay, so happy to welcome you here. I promised myself I wouldn't spend too much time telling you how much you helped me when I had health problems a couple of years ago. Everyone that I was trying to find out about fatty liver was just saying the laziest things like standard American diet. And I just got so frustrated. And then I found you and listened for a long time. And you really helped me. I'm really excited to talk to you. You're a little bit of a celebrity to me.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm really glad that I was able to help.
Okay, so just off the top, can you explain what your approach is to health, metabolic health, and how it differs from other people? We could spend the whole time talking about that, but just give it a go.
Of course. So I operate through what's called the bioenergetic approach to health, which essentially means that we're looking at health through the lens of the energy that our cells produce, and considering the fact that when we produce enough energy, we're able to function properly, we're able to maintain healthy organs and healthy general function, immune function, digestion, brain function, reproductive function. All of those things depend on having enough energy. And when we have problems with producing energy, which is so common because so many things in our environment, from the food to chemical problems, and I'm sure we'll talk about those when it comes to estrogen as well, and various other things will interfere with our capacity to produce energy. So when that happens, then we're no longer able to function optimally. We don't have enough energy to go to everything from proper immune function to digestion to everything else. And our bodies sense that. So not only do we not have enough energy for it, but then our bodies say, all right, if we don't have enough energy, we have a lot of years ahead of us. We've got a lot of time ahead of us. We have to prepare for that. And so they then turn down their metabolic rate even further to conserve energy. And that's especially where something like reproduction comes in and the reproductive hormones, because a situation where we don't have enough energy available, and this doesn't just mean food, but it means food that we can actually use and convert effectively to ATP in our cells. When that's not the case, the last thing our bodies want to do is reproduce, because reproduction requires a ton of energy. We don't just have to be able to sustain ourselves, but also another human being and grow it, develop it, and then feed it and care for it and all of the rest. So that's a system that's very sensitive to how energetically favorable our environment is. So that's really what the foundation of the bioenergetic view, that we're looking at foods, supplements, sunlight, sleep, hormones, everything through this lens of how it interacts with our energy systems. Do they support energy production, or instead are they involved in a system that gets activated, which we would call this the stress system, when we don't have enough energy available? And then we can look at that and see how it affects all these other disease processes or health states. And you mentioned fatty liver, for example, which is a perfect example of a state where people would say this is a state of excess energy. You have too many calories coming in, too much fat or sugar or whatever the problem is, and that's causing fat to accumulate in the liver. But the reality is, instead, this isn't a state of too much energy, but it's a state where our ability to produce energy is blocked. There are things blocking the mitochondria in our cells, which is where we produce energy. And as a result, we end up with less energy, which means liver dysfunction and inflammation and fibrosis. And then we also end up with extra fuel that we try to store as fat because we can't produce energy from it. And our bodies are seeing this as a state of scarcity, of stress. And so they want to store that fuel for future use. So that's just a good example of exactly what we're talking about here.
And that's why when I heard you, I was like, because no one would believe me, but I'm like, you don't have to tell me to stop going to McDonald's. I never go to McDonald's. You don't have to tell me to work out. I work out. I'm going to try not to mention it again, but it's just, it was so great to hear. So as we're going along our lives, what kinds of things are we doing that are messing with this energy system?
Most everything. Most of what we do. And as I said, we can view, and I think it's really valuable to view all sorts of different things that aren't optimal through this lens of energy production. So on one hand, I think one of the worst things is the chronic dieting, the eat less, exercise more narrative that leads us to doing exactly that, depleting energy, because if we take away our fuel and we increase our exercise, meaning that we force the fuel that we do have to just be burned off during exercise, we're leaving our body, our organ systems, all of our functions with very little energy, which basically means that, yes, in the short term, we're going to lose body fat, we're going to lose weight. But in the long term, our body is going to do everything it can to gain body fat and hold on to weight. And this is where you see that yo-yoing, where, we are at a weight we don't like, we diet, we lose weight, and then we normally regain it all and more. And then we say, I know what the problem was. When I was dieting, I just didn't stick to it long enough. It just wasn't the exact right diet. And we go back to it and we do it again and again. And all during that time, even though there's the up and down, it tends to still be going up. And the range of ups and downs are higher and higher every time. And at the same time, our health is going down. We tend to see more of the brain fog, the insomnia, degeneration of our hair, skin, and nails, low body temperature, all sorts of signs that our bodies are turning down their metabolic rate, which just, again, leaves us to be more prone to weight gain and more prone to these health issues. So I think on one hand, the dieting culture is one of the worst things in terms of what's going on in our modern lives that's causing problems here. But then to add on top of that, the types of things in our food supply, one of the most ubiquitous is the polyunsaturated fats, or PUFA. These are the ones that are in the seed oils that everyone's talking about now, but they're not only in seed oils, they're in other foods too. But those are really good at turning down our metabolic rate, at impairing our energy production or ATP production. So just having those basically tries to shift us away from producing energy and toward more of a hibernation state, which is basically their function in nature and animals who are eating a lot of these fats and plants who produce these fats. It's basically to survive in cold weather and basically hibernate and be able to survive when conditions aren't optimal. But that's not what we want to be doing, right? We want to be able to be alive and high functioning and all of the rest as opposed to hibernating. So polyunsaturated fats are a big one. And on top of that, we can talk about the actual stress, psychological stress of the amount of work that we do, the lack of sleep, all the things that we put on ourselves in the modern day. And then we can get into pesticides and the lack of vitamins and minerals in our food, which we need those to produce energy, right? So there's two sides to that equation. There's the fuel that we have, specifically carbs and fats are the main fuels that we use for producing energy, but we also need to have enough vitamins and minerals to be able to effectively do that. We need to have the right hormonal state to support that, meaning good thyroid function, enough progesterone, testosterone, some of those reproductive hormones. And we don't want to have the things that are blocking that state. And that's where stress hormones come in. That's where, as I mentioned, things like pesticides, heavy metals can come in. Another huge one, as we mentioned, is PUFA, but another one on top of that is bacterial compounds from the gut. So when we have an unhealthy microbiome, we have a lot of bacteria that produce a compound called lipopolysaccharide, or also known as endotoxin. An endotoxin is something that's really good at blocking our ability to produce energy. And as a result, it's seen in really high levels in obesity and diabetes and fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, and on from there. But that's another huge one here is that so many people are struggling with their gut health because of these other things that we're doing that turn down our metabolic function and our ability to digest food well. And then we get this compounding problem where we end up with bacterial overgrowths that are producing toxic things that then interfere further with liver function and brain function and all the rest. So it's if we wanted to create an environment to block our ability to produce energy and degenerate health, we've done a pretty good job.
And you mentioned light, not just
Yeah.
getting sunlight. So quickly, if you can, not quickly, take your time, but just talk about the role of light, but then how we mess that up.
Yeah, light's a really interesting one. So sunlight includes a number of different forms of light that have a lot of benefit. So on one hand, we have different forms of red light that are typically much higher in sunlight and much lower in the indoor lighting that we use. And red light really directly not only supports our ability to produce energy, but we actually are able to absorb that red light and directly have energy as a result. Like it actually creates energy when it interacts with the protein structure in our cells. And so that alone is basically energy promoting, energy giving, that red light. And the infrared light has some similar effects as well. Both of those are light that we would have been constantly exposed to throughout the day, naturally, so to speak. But now when we're indoors and using, especially the LED and fluorescent type lighting, which is really high in the blue light and very low in the red light, we lose out, we miss out on that energy giving property. But then on top of that, the blue light is fine during the day. There's a lot of blue light that comes from sunlight, but what we don't want is to be having a lot of blue light in the kind of morning and evening when, the sun is going to mostly be red and orange. And our body is attuned to those kinds of signals. And so when we then introduce our modern lighting into our environment in the evenings and mornings, we're disrupting all of the signals that our bodies would get that tell us it's time to wind down and go to sleep. And then in the morning, it's time to wake up and jumpstart at all of our systems. And we're not getting that. We're really disrupting that. And that disrupts our circadian rhythm, which also interacts with our mitochondrial function. So that's another factor. And then there's also the UV light from the sun, which we've been told is damaging, and we need to block it out as much as we can with constant sunscreens and sunblocks. And there's truth to that, of course, that too much UV light, especially out of balance, can cause damage. And this is especially the case if our tissues are loaded up with the polyunsaturated fats, because these are those PUFAs that we were talking about earlier and the seed oils. We know that those fats are much less stable and much more susceptible to damage. And when the fat composition of every cell in our body is determined by the types of fats that we're eating. So if we're eating more of these polyunsaturated fats, we end up with more of them in the structure of our cells. And that means that our cells are more susceptible to damage, both internally, but also the cells on our skin, when they're exposed to UV light, are going to be much more susceptible to damage. And also, when you couple that with this poor metabolic state, there's a lot more oxidative stress and inflammation, which means we're not able to properly like we're drained of our antioxidants, so we don't effectively reverse the damage that's coming about from sunlight. So there's a number of things here that all lead us to be very susceptible to damage from the UV light. But the reality is, if those things aren't the case and we're in a good metabolic state, we're not eating a lot of those polyunsaturated fats, so our cells are more stable and they're able to sustain that light, especially in combination with the red light from the sun, which is very protective. We're not actually going to get that same sort of UV damage, of course, unless we're out in the sun for way too long and getting burned and things like that. And that's a different story, obviously something we don't recommend. But yeah, the light aspect is huge. And with the UV light, we do get a number of benefits as well. It increases dopamine, it increases the production of steroid hormones, increases vitamin D production, which is also in some ways could be considered a steroid hormone. So there's a lot of benefits to it that most of us are missing out on between staying mostly inside and when we're outside being as covered as possible. And if the parts that aren't covered are all covered with sunblock, and then we can add on the other chemicals and most of the sunscreens and sunblocks that make things that much worse. So
I stopped using sunscreen when I was 35 because I was in Dominican and I sprayed it on and it melted my toenail polish. And I thought, this cannot be good.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
I
probably
s-
think it's the same thing. Yeah.
What's it doing to my insides? Okay. So then people are struggling at all ages with many things. But in the midlife space, when people hit perimenopause, they're really hitting a wall. And the sort of medical explanation of that is that you lose estrogen and you become estrogen deficient. And that's over on the mainstream side. And then we have the forward thinkers, naturopathic doctors, and integrative physicians, and they're looking at progesterone and how progesterone falls in the early stages, and that can lead to some of the sleep and mood issues, and estrogen rises and falls. So we have a lot of division about how to view it. But when you see this, and from your framework, what do you think is wrong with the approach that's the mainstream, and how does your approach explain it?
Sure. So yeah, I would say that we're already set up to have problems going in, right? The as we were talking about, every aspect of our environment is already leading to degradations of our health. And then we're going to see those things generally show up during major times of change in the body, and especially hormonal change. And I think symptoms around puberty are far more common these days as well in both men and women. And then, I mean, after that too, on the reproductive side, sky high rates of infertility and PCOS and endometriosis, and these things are so far underdiagnosed as it is. So when we consider the amount of hormonal issues that women are having before this point anyway is already astronomical. And then we basically enter the state where I would say the main driver of these symptoms is that we're no longer producing the really protective hormone progesterone. And then we're left with this unopposed estrogen. And so that leads us to a couple of, I think, kind of misconceptions around these hormones. And so one of the starting ones is this idea that estrogen is the primary female reproductive hormone, and it is primarily responsible for most of the good things. And then the production stops once we hit perimenopause, menopause. And the reality I would say is, for one, obviously there's a role of estrogen in reproduction and in other moments in time, but I would argue that progesterone is really the primary reproductive female hormone, and that the reality is once perimenopause really hits, or especially menopause, and the ovaries generally turn down the hormone production, it's true that they're no longer producing estrogen and progesterone. But the reality is all of the other tissues in our body are still able to produce estrogen, and they do. So when you look at, this brings us to this next misconception, which is that when you look at the blood levels of estrogen, when this is what many practitioners are doing, they'll see as the transition goes on through perimenopause and into menopause, estrogen levels fall dramatically. And the assumption is that must be the driver of the symptoms, let's replace it. But the reality is, just because those levels are falling in the blood doesn't mean that there's actually a systemic deficiency in estrogen. And when you actually look at the tissues, you look at the body fat, the bone, the heart, the muscle, all these other areas, there is adequate estrogen there, if not even excessively high estrogen there, despite, again, these low levels seen in the blood. So the idea that all of these symptoms that we're seeing during this time are due to an estrogen deficiency is built on this idea that, one, estrogen is the thing helping these areas out in the first place. And then two, the idea that estrogen levels are actually falling during this time and there's a deficiency of estrogen. But the reality is when we look elsewhere and see that the actual processes of estrogen production are not impaired in this state, and we actually look at those estrogen levels and see that they're still elevated, then we know that isn't actually responsible for these symptoms. But what we do know is that progesterone, there actually is a deficiency there, and there actually is a lack of progesterone production. And these symptoms that we see during this time, the mood swings, the anxiety, the insomnia, the weight gain, tend to be symptoms that we see with estrogen dominance, excess estrogen, lack of progesterone, all throughout a woman's lifetime. It's the exact same things that we see with those symptoms, and it's really the same thing that's going on here, is what we're often seeing is this estrogen dominant state. And that's not surprising. Again, not only considering what's going on inside the body due to just the natural hormonal state, but then also considering all of the factors in our environment that are pushing us toward this state of excess estrogen and a lack of progesterone, where so many of the insults I mentioned before, everything from the polyunsaturated fats to endotoxin from the gut to the pesticides and the toxic compounds in the skincare, including in the sunscreens, those all happen to be estrogenic. And we'll talk about this in a moment. I don't think that's happenstance at all. I don't think it's just coincidence. But there's so many aspects there that are estrogenic. And we have other aspects of our food too. A lot of the currently promoted foods tend to have very estrogenic effects. A lot of the beans, legumes, nuts and seeds, raw cruciferous vegetables all have a lot of estrogenic compounds in there. So we're inundated with it from our environment. We're left without progesterone at this point. And then also, when we have all this degeneration we talked about earlier, we're not able to effectively clear estrogen. The main place that happens is starting in the liver. That's where we detoxify it, like most other toxic things and most hormones and neurotransmitters and things like that. And then it's cleared through the bile, and so which goes through the intestines and then comes out through but liver dysfunction is really, really common. We were touching on it earlier with fatty liver, but pretty much everything that is damaging our system is going to have some pretty central effects at the liver and impair our proper detoxification pathways, impair bile production and flow. And then the other thing is when we have intestinal inflammation and these bacterial issues, we tend to have problems actually excreting these toxic compounds, and we tend to reabsorb them. So we see a lot more reabsorption of estrogen in these states. So all of these things come together to bring us to a state that we're told is a state of estrogen deficiency, but really is often a state of even more estrogen excess than we had before.
It's like upside down world. Like I can imagine someone listening to this is going to say, no, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. Do you get that reaction from people when you explain this?
Yeah, with a lot of different things, right? Whether we're talking about the idea that the carbohydrates aren't causing fatty liver, the sugar isn't causing fatty liver, not to say that table sugars are perfect health food or anything like that. But yeah, that's the case with most things, right? And I would have said the same thing, or I did say the same thing about a lot of these views at one point. And I think if someone's having that, I think when we're having that reflex, it's always a good indication that maybe we'll stop, breathe, take whatever we're listening in with as much of an objective point of view as we can, and then spend our time researching and digging into it ourselves and see what we come to. But yeah, that is a really common reaction with something that's so counter to what we're told and pretty much everywhere.
And of course, we're told it's an estrogen deficiency and that you should replace the estrogen and you should use FDA approved estrogen with the progestin or progesterone. There doesn't seem to be a lot of distinction in the mainstream. And I've heard you call this a Band-Aid, and I just want to know if someone's listening and they bought into this and their doctor's telling them their levels are, women love to say, oh, I had nothing. I was like bottomed out in my estrogen. And I had someone ask me like, what are your levels? And I said, I have no idea. I don't know. But what where does hormone therapy sit? This belief system that hormone therapy will fix this. And so many women do feel better, like overnight.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. The first question when we're talking about hormone replacement, the first thing I would say is we always want to do what we can to support the environment first. This is the same thing I would say with men and TRT, for example, testosterone replacement. If you're in an environment that drove low testosterone in the first place and we just replace it, we're ignoring the reason why we're in that state in the first place. And just trying to fix the outcome often comes at a cost that we're not seeing. So another way of saying it is there's a reason why our bodies turn down this reproductive hormone, probably relating to what we were talking about earlier with energy deficiency and chronic stress, and our body saying reproduction is not on the table right now. And if you then replace that hormone, you're basically forcing your body to prioritize something that it doesn't have the energy for, and that has to come from somewhere else. So there's no free lunch in that regard, and we have to be very careful with any hormone replacement therapy as a result. That doesn't mean there's no place for it. I think it can be really beneficial, certain types of hormone replacement, and we'll get into those specifics, but I think that's an important framework is we want to make sure that if we're going to be trying to support any hormonal pathway, that we have the foundational state in place, we have the energy available, the nutrients available. We're not burning the candle at both ends by putting our body into a state of, quote, hormone deficiency, and then at the same time, just replacing the hormone and not considering that our bodies are intelligent, adaptive systems. And if they've turned down the hormonal production, it's probably for a reason. So that would be my first kind of big picture thought.
And when it comes, you said some hormone therapy is applicable. It does make sense. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so as you said, there can be a lot of improvement symptom-wise when it comes to replacing the hormones. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that hormone is beneficial. So as an example, we know that cortisol is our main stress hormone and has a lot of negative effects, right? It's one of the main mediators that's going to turn down our reproductive hormones during stress. It's also one of the main things that will turn down our thyroid hormone production and conversion during stress. It turns down immune function. It causes us to be prone to storing bile. And on from there. It's basically like a degenerative hormone that we don't want to be getting too much of. But we also know that if you utilize cortisone or prednisone, any of the glucocorticoid drugs, they have a really strong anti-inflammatory effect. And people use them for skin issues, especially autoimmune conditions. They'll use them internally for severe inflammatory states, autoimmune states, infections, damage to injuries, things like that. And it lowers swelling and it generally lowers inflammation. But that doesn't make it a good thing, right? We know that maybe it's necessary in some of these cases, or maybe it's not necessary, but it still has some of these, quote, beneficial effects. But we also know that it's having a lot of negative effects along with that. And the way that we're getting those beneficial effects comes at a cost. This is not a hormone that we want to be increasing. And I would say that the effects of most of the estrogens are very parallel to that. And part of that is also because they actually increase the glucocorticoid activity themselves. So the first point there is that just because something improves our symptoms or helps us feel better doesn't necessarily mean that it's healthy for us. Doesn't mean it's something we want to be utilizing any more than is maybe absolutely necessary in certain severe states. And along those lines, it's true that estrogen does have anti-inflammatory effects. And one of the main reasons for that is that it functions much like other stress hormones. So when we think of something like cortisol, again, I think the general thought is this is universally bad. And we're not considering that it has these, quote, beneficial effects. The problem is just that we don't want to be in a state where we have to use it, and we don't want to be encouraging the production of it. And estrogen is very similar. So when we experience stress, estrogen is a primary part of our response to it. It helps with that response to stress, just like cortisol does, just like adrenaline does, just like growth hormone does, because estrogen is also intimately involved in growth, as we know. It's involved with growth in the reproductive system and actually the growth of the fetus and our growth and development early on. And so it has an integral role there, and it's also involved in the growth of any tissue and helps because growth is an important part of our stress response. If we get a cut on our arm, we need growth factors to help regenerate the skin and close up the cut and the wound and things like that. But in the process, a lot of like our whole stress, immune, inflammatory system is activated. We have the release of histamine and nitric oxide, and we have increases in swelling, we have increases in cortisol. And all of these, again, they're not inherently bad. They serve a purpose. We need them in this state, but that doesn't mean we want to be increasing them. And estrogen does those same things. It is really well known to increase histamine production, which is why it's implicated in mast cell activation syndrome. It's known to increase swelling and is often responsible for the different parts of the menstrual cycle, where a lot of swelling is seen sometimes around ovulation, sometimes more right before the period starts. And along with that, swelling in the brain is another factor, which tends to cause headaches and migraines, which is, I wouldn't say common, but a symptom that's sometimes seen alongside those certain points of the menstrual cycle. And again, part of that is necessary for ovulation and other factors here, and the growth of the uterine lining and things like that. Like, it's involved in the growth. But again, it doesn't mean it's something that we want to be universally increasing. And without getting too much deeper into the physiology of it, the short of it is, yes, we will get symptom relief many times from using the estrogen, at least in the short term, the different estrogen replacement. In the long term, it tends to come crashing down. And at most, it's a Band-Aid, but if we're going to use a Band-Aid, I would so much prefer to use one that's actually going to be supportive of our health in the long term, as opposed to one that's generally going to detract from it. So if we were talking about hormone replacement during perimenopause or menopause, I would much prefer to utilize progesterone, which doesn't have the same immediate effects all the time. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it has an immediate calming effect and kind of mood boosting effect and things like that. It helps with the insomnia side. But some of the other effects, it's a little bit gentler in terms of the improvements that are seen, but it's actually something that's supporting the overall metabolic state and not something that's giving us some sort of short-term relief at a long-term cost.
And how do you factor in the findings for prevention? Because it's really being pushed now, hormone therapy, to prevent heart disease and prevent dementia, also obviously for bone loss. And there are observational studies. And I think in February, there was a 6-year study taken out of the Women's Health Initiative that showed a positive impact on the earlier stages of heart disease, like cholesterol, good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, et cetera. How do you reckon with those findings? Because I know you're so good at looking at studies and saying, no.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of points to consider here. So one is that, again, there is a role for estrogen in certain tissues, but normally that's not a limiting factor, right? As we were saying, while the ovaries might really shut down during this time, we're still able to produce estrogen inside these other tissues. And so we don't need to be providing exogenous estrogen to support bone health and things like that. But it does have some of those specific effects that we were talking about, right? Like maintaining bone health and mineralization. But it's not the only thing that does. So I would say some of the main drivers of osteopenia and osteoporosis are actually deficiencies in pregnenolone and progesterone. And pregnenolone and different pregnenolone analogs are being studied to reverse osteoporosis with great benefit as well. So again, if you were to say, and this doesn't exactly work with cortisol, because cortisol actually will break down bone and it tends to be more catabolic hormone. But if you were just looking at a particular endpoint, let's say the improvement of certain like skin lesions, and you were using cortisone or some other corticosteroid, you would see a lot of benefits there, but there would also be some major costs. And so I think it's something that we're seeing similarly here. It's also worth noting that this isn't universal, right? So in the other parts of the Women's Health Initiative study, it was shown to have negative effects. The estrogen provision was shown to have negative effects in terms of bone health and cardiovascular health. And part of that might depend on when it was started and some of the specifics of how the studies were carried out. But it definitely tells us that there's not this universal protective effect. And I think it also points to the fact that there's, again, the other part of it too is you did have the progestins there in certain cases. And progesterone has a number of positive effects, as we were saying, in osteoporosis and a number of these other places. And progestins have some progesterone-like effects. So there's some ways that they do mimic progesterone, but at the same time, they tend to have estrogenic effects as well. And that's just because they're very similar in terms of structure between estrogen and progesterone. And when we're creating synthetic progesterone, which is what the progestins are, they tend to have estrogenic effects, whereas progesterone itself actually doesn't, but it's much more of a unique steroid hormone. So yes, there might be certain instances that we see benefits, but I would say there's also a lot of studies that have pointed to concerns regarding different cancers, and some others that are pointing to concerns regarding cardiovascular health and bone health. And so even if we're seeing some level of benefit here, I would say, A, we can get that same benefit without the costs using other protective hormones like pregnenolone and progesterone. And then B, we definitely need to pay extra attention to those costs when it comes to the estrogen like hormones. And there's a lot of that throughout research where when like we can utilize a very particular outcome to try to come to a certain conclusion in a study. And this was something that was done in a lot of the hormesis research. Hormesis is this idea that you provide something that's poisonous or toxic, and it causes your body to respond defensively. It adapts to it and it gets stronger. And so they would do these studies where they would provide cadmium, arsenic, or mercury, and they would say, look, it actually reduced tumor growth in these certain areas or led to some benefit. And then and that was the conclusion of the study. And everyone said, okay, great. Like, it's fine that we have these in our food supply and just around us in our environment and the pesticides and things like that, because they're actually benefiting us. And then decades later, you have reviews of these studies, and they actually show that, sure, there was some benefit in terms of tumors in the pancreas, let's say. But when you look at the rest of the body, there's actually an increase in cancer and tumor growth. And it's just another, I think, example of where you want to focus on. And there's, not that this is everything, but it's worth noting that there's a huge industry drive for estrogen-like compounds to have benefits because of how profitable HRT has been since the early to mid 1900s, where there would be different estrogenic hormones, and it's really easy to just create lots of different estrogen-like compounds. There's tons of them because, as we're saying, there's so many things in our environment that kind of mimic or act like estrogen and have estrogen-like effects because it's more of a universal signal of stress. And so you see the history of all these different forms of estrogen that were marketed for supporting pregnancy, for reducing miscarriage, for supporting bone health, for supporting cardiovascular health, for supporting brain health. And basically they would have the swath of studies showing benefits. And then just a few years later, normally not a few, maybe 10 or 15 years later, after this has been sold to tons of women to, let's say, support pregnancy or whatever it is, they then come out and see all of these side effects that have happened. And DES is one of the most prominent examples of this, which just had terrible effects for generations after for the women who were using this during pregnancy. But again, then they would take that one off the market and provide some other form of estrogen used for a different means, and sometimes for the exact opposite means. So in this case, DES was something that was used to support pregnancy, and then afterward they end up coming out with other forms of estrogen that are very similar to prevent pregnancy by use as like birth control as contraception. So it's an area where, because of the industry influences, we have to be really careful. And it's when you have influence like that's gone on for over 70 years, it's something that ends up getting baked into the education of generations of doctors, practitioners. And so it becomes really challenging to shift a view that's set. And yeah, so that would be a couple of things that come to mind when it comes to those sorts of studies.
It's hard to counter because you see these doctors and then are on Oprah and they're saying this 50% reduction here, 50% reduction there. You're saying, yes, if you just look at that, but you don't pay attention to all this. You're saying that's how you're able to do that?
That's a huge part of it. And then also it would depend on the exact study, but sometimes what they might do is take a slice of the larger population that is showing more of what they are wanting to see. When, instead, when you look at the whole population, it's not showing that. Maybe you can find some women of a certain age with certain predispositions and certain characteristics going in. And for that exact population, you can sort out that from this data, there was a reduction in risk of these other things. But are we just isolating this one group to try to find that outcome? Or is there actually like a legitimate reason why it would be different in some women of some population versus another?
And what about testosterone? This is super trendy for women too. And I don't even know if it's a menopause thing. It's just a use your tea thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And again, something that I would say testosterone doesn't fall in the same kind of stress hormone category, and it does have a number of benefits, but there are some concerns as well. So the first one, as I mentioned earlier, is the general concern with hormone replacement, which is that if our body is at a point where it's underproducing testosterone, there's a reason for that. It's not just random, it's not just chance, it's not just our bodies being stupid. There's a reason why they've decided to do so. Maybe they want to disfavor the production of muscle right now because of we're in that conservation state, we're in that scarcity state. Or another factor being that maybe the reason why we're seeing low testosterone is that a lot of it is being converted downstream to estrogen. Maybe we're in this highly estrogen dominant state where we have a lot of the enzyme aromatase, which converts androgens like testosterone to estrogens. So I think so often it becomes that allopathic approach where we see a number on a test and this is low, so let's replace it. Let's bring that number up without considering that larger picture. And if we're in a state of estrogen dominance with high expression of aromatase, we can be providing testosterone. But in order to get that value up, we're going to have to provide so much that even though a large portion is being converted down to other estrogens, we're still getting enough testosterone there, which means we're just driving that estrogen dominant state even further. And again, the expression of aromatase not only is just something that'll generally increase due to stress, but so many things in our environment will upregulate aromatase. The chemicals in plastics, the chemicals in our soaps and shampoos and skincare products, the polyunsaturated fats, endotoxin. There's so many things around us that are going to increase aromatase expression. So I think we would want to be really careful when it comes to testosterone replacement. And again, if it was a situation where we were providing testosterone that's impossible to be converted downstream to estrogens, I would be less concerned. It would more so just be the first concern of this is maybe a Band-Aid that we just want to make sure we're fixing the underlying state at the same time. And there's a place for Band-Aids because if we're in a really rough spot and dealing with a lot of symptoms, that can compound and make it even harder to get good sleep to support our testosterone production, eat well, and all the rest. But that's not the case, right? It's not just a Band-Aid, but also we have this concern of conversion down to estrogens. And so that's generally not something I'd recommend, maybe in very small doses in the context that we're already working on lowering the conversion toward estrogen. We're already working on the foundations. And maybe if we have other things on board that actually lower aromatase. And two of the most important ones here, which I touched on earlier, are pregnenolone and progesterone. And so many of the things that we're using estrogen for, whether it's bone health, cardiovascular health, or the kind of more reproductive related symptoms, or anxiety, weight gain, pregnenolone and progesterone are really effective at supporting us through those processes and reversing those kinds of symptoms. So I would so much more recommend that we lean into those as opposed to, especially as opposed to any estrogen therapy, but as opposed to testosterone therapy as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating that they're not even considered hormone therapy. Like estrogen, when they do surveys, I think they did one last year that went to the Menopause Society annual general meeting, and it was just estrogen containing hormone therapy. Any other hormone type therapy isn't even considered. Okay, so when women are in this state, because what I get is, but I'm struggling, and a woman who's struggling doesn't have time or energy or patience, she's being crunched. What are some top line things that get missed that you think people can do?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And as we were touching on, there's a place for Band-Aids, right? There's a place for using things that help to bridge that gap when we're really not feeling good. Pregnenolone and progesterone are great there. Vitamin E is another one that's really effective there for supporting more of the progesterone side and reducing aromatase. There's some other more simple, straightforward things we can do on the diet, right? Cutting out the PUFA, shifting toward more monounsaturated and saturated fats for cooking, using coconut oil, butter, beef tallow, olive oil instead of the canola and soy oil. Being really careful if we're eating out at restaurants and trying to avoid those kinds of oils there, which is one of the toughest things. Reducing alcohol consumption. We didn't even talk about alcohol, but you create this environment of intense stress, and then you basically provide the answer in alcohol, and we see it everywhere in every TV show and everything culturally. There's obviously the stigma around drugs. I think drugs, so to speak, illicit drugs, is lowering a little bit. With some, I think there's some positives and negatives baked in there, but alcohol is used to calm down the stress at the end of the day is pretty, for the most part, not very much maligned. It's looked at as like a normal coping mechanism, even maybe a healthy one, or not healthy one, but it's okay. It's like everyone does it. And alcohol is really strongly estrogenic. So just another thing in our environment that's driving that. But on the flip side, we can lower our alcohol consumption, keep away from the PUFA. We can make sure that we're supporting our gut health with good quality ripe fruits, cooked vegetables. There's a really great tool that Ray Peat came up with called the carrot salad, which is where you use a raw carrot and you shred it and add a little bit of some form of oil. Normally I recommend olive oil. It's a little easier to use than coconut oil, which just hardens on it. And a little bit of vinegar. Really any form of vinegar is fine. And it does a really great job of supporting motility, reducing constipation, which helps to move estrogen through the intestines. Helps bind with the toxic things that we're excreting in the bile, like estrogen, and prevent it from being reabsorbed. And then you have some gentle antimicrobial effects coming through from the polyphenols in the carrot and the olive oil and the vinegar as well. So not only is that a nice tool that can sometimes make a huge difference, but it also points to some of these really major factors that tend to cause estrogen issues. Slow motility is a huge one. So when we have this combination of chronic long-term estrogen exposure, reduced liver function, poor bile flow, bacterial overgrowths, we tend to see constipation very frequently. It's really common with women dealing with these estrogen dominance type symptoms. And getting the motility going can make a massive difference when it comes to the hormonal state. And yeah, carrot salad can be a great tool for that. Taking out the really hard to digest foods, the beans and legumes, the grains and nuts and seeds, especially the ones that are not properly prepared. If we're doing fermented grains like sourdough or sprouted lentils or something like that, it deactivates a lot of the anti-nutrients in there, which can prevent some of those negative effects on the gut. That's at least a starting place, but maybe reducing those, making sure we're preparing them in an effective way. That'll help lower the bacterial overgrowth. That'll help get our motility going. Using some extra liver support can make a big difference here for clearing out the estrogen and supporting bile flow, which will help also clear it out and then help to clear out the bacteria, help to get the motility going. So some things that can be effective there would be amino acids like glycine and taurine, and then also some herbs like nettle root can be effective, ginger root. Both of those have anti-estrogenic effects and also have a lot of beneficial effects at the liver. And there's a number of others that you could look at: milk thistle, burdock root, dandelion root, chicory root tend to have a lot of beneficial effects at the liver, helping with detoxification processes there. And they also have some benefits in the gut too. So those are just a few starting places. Obviously, the more we can chip away and get our foundations to a good place and give ourselves at least 8 hours for good sleep and work on the stress reduction throughout the day and getting the sunlight that we talked about earlier, good consistent movement, all of those things will work, but it takes time, right? It's not here's the one pill that we can just take, all your symptoms go away and you don't even have to worry about it. There's no, as I said earlier, there's no free lunch like that anywhere when it comes to health. And we're promised that all the time because it's quick and it's easy and we're uncomfortable and maybe uncomfortable is even like a gentle word. We might be just feeling really bad day to day. And so we want anything that'll be that quick fix. I think on one hand, the unfortunate reality is that there really isn't something like that. I think in a global sense, it's actually a good thing, because if that was the case, it would be like overriding all of the biological systems that our body has built up over millions and millions of years to determine how to properly respond to an environment. And as I was saying earlier, this is part of why we want to be careful with HRT and just saying, yes, you are smart and intelligent. You've decided to do all of these things to protect me And yet I'm just going to override it with hormone. Anyway, but that's a zoomed out, bigger picture.
That's a whole
conversation.
nother story, trusting this magnificent machine over the outside world. I've even seen some backlash against carrot salads on social media. And I thought, come on, what could possibly be wrong with the carrot salad? I don't know. I guess sometimes people take it too far, right? They start having multiple carrot salads a day or something.
Yeah, maybe. I think that's
Something
okay too.
fine. Yeah, I think it would be
Yeah.
fine. Okay, where can people work with you and find you?
Sure. My website's jayfeldmanwellness.com. I recommend people head over there, and as a starting place, they can download the free Energy Balance Food Guide, which goes through all the different foods that help to support our metabolism on an easy to read one-page infographic. And then also, if we are dealing with some of those digestive symptoms I mentioned, the slow motility, bloating, gas, things that indicate that our gut is an issue, there's a separate scale on there that goes through how to adjust your foods, which ones you want to favor, which ones you might want to avoid if you're dealing with those issues. So listeners can download that for free at jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide. And then, yeah, there's a tons of other free resources on the website and links to the articles page and podcast episodes where I talk in a lot more detail about how to fix a lot of the underlying drivers that we talked about here, and offer coaching and some different coaching programs as well. And of course, to help walk people through that too.
Okay. I can't thank you enough. You've really laid things out for me. I feel a lot. I feel like I know a lot. I feel like more sure. I wander through here and I'm like, I don't even know, but I get certain, and then someone says something, and you can't be too certain about anything because it all changes. And that's the approach I love that you have. Yeah.
Yeah, I always want to keep an open mind for sure, but you're welcome. And I appreciate you saying all that. It's always really great to hear.
Okay. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Anne-Marie.
Hotflash Inc. was created and is hosted by Anne-Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Anne-Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hotflash Inc. Media.